current phase of the conflict in Gaza, Matt, how do you find it right now between Israel and Hezbollah, and how dangerous is getting, in your opinion? Are we gonna have some sort of attacks on the part of Israelis on Hezbollah before Netanyahu going to the United States?
You know, the timing is going to be very interesting on that, with Netanyahu coming to the United States. I believe it's July 24th is when he's supposed to address the joint session of Congress. And the reports of the United States government officials saying that's about when they expect Israel to launch an attack into Lebanon. Certainly nothing tells us that either side is backing down. The warnings, the threats, what's being put out there as whether statements, or we had, well, maybe 2 weeks ago now, you had Hezbollah release the drone camera footage where it's flying over all types of Israeli military and civilian infrastructure. I mean, so the warnings just keep coming. The threats keep coming. I don't think any of us can take for 1 second think that any of this is false. It may be some bravado where it's going to need the other side, their adversary, whoever we're talking about, whoever the subject is, to be the one to do something to initiate it. But certainly, they're both pushing, and they both have their backs against the wall in the sense of where they've put themselves with their own statements, with their own actions. You hear reports that Israeli tanks are going into Gaza without tank shells. Which they've destroyed everything, so they really don't need the tank shells anymore. Those tanks probably carry 5,000 to 10,000 rounds of machine gun bullets on it, so that's what they use to massacre civilians. So the idea, though, that the tank shells are being held back as well because that's what they need in Lebanon. That in Lebanon, their tanks will have to operate as tanks, not as demolition equipment. And so you're seeing these different indications, you're seeing different reports, some you take with a grain of salt. But yeah, anyone who's looking at this has to have the same pit in their stomach, the same nervous tension, the same traces of adrenaline starting to flow through us about where we're at and the concern that comes with it. And this fact that Netanyahu being in DC the same time when this occurs, you can't see that happening. I just can't imagine the prime minister not being there when they launch an attack into Israel. I mean, it's into Lebanon, excuse me. But the same vein, you could see how Netanyahu would manipulate it, right? Would make his presence known to ensure that the United States is providing all the support it can to Lebanon. And just as we had these questions about October 7th, what did the Israelis know? Did they let this happen? Certainly their disregard for their own people, as we've now seen with really kind of damning reporting by Haaretz in terms of the Hannibal Directive being put into place on October 7th. Certainly there's no question about this, that the Israelis have any concern for their own people. So this idea that what would the Israelis allow to happen? What would they prompt? What would they manipulate in order to allow it for a perfect presentation for Netanyahu to be in DC, to push the Americans to send F-18s and F-35s and our F-15s and our F-16s and our B-1s against Hezbollah targets because they killed these innocent Israeli civilians, just as the Americans gave all this support, minus actually pulling the triggers themselves following October 7th. I think the Israelis are calculating that Hezbollah's actions will be such that the Americans, they can be pushed over that line and become an adjunct to the Israeli Air Force and missile forces as well.
Yeah. Matt, when you look at this new report, as you've mentioned in this Israeli media, what was the concept, in your opinion? How they can do that? What kind of ideology would do that?
I think, and I'll be as generous as I can with my kind of limited understanding of why they would do it. I think the concept is that it occurs in the idea of the Hannibal Directive. If people aren't aware of what this is, it's this idea, it's this directive, for lack of a better term, that the Israeli military has, that it's better for an Israeli soldier to be killed by Israeli forces than to have them taken hostage, prisoner, captive, whatever, by an adversary. That the greater importance is the withholding from Israel's adversaries the presence of a live Israeli soldier as opposed to just one more dead Israeli soldier. That in the larger picture, it's more important to keep that type of propaganda win away from the enemy than it is for us to not bury one more body or two bodies. What we saw happen on October 7th, I wasn't certain of it. Others weren't. Some people were adamant about it, but now we certainly know. A directive was put forward for 3 of the Israeli military facilities, as well as along the gate, the fence line to Gaza, to destroy anything approaching, any vehicle going to Gaza. Now, you also have to remember that the Israelis knew full well about the Hamas plans for October 7th. They knew that this was going to be a prisoner taking, a hostage taking, a kidnapping operation first and foremost. So they certainly understand, and they knew this for, as we know, because it's been reported on and it was leaked out of the Israeli military. They had the operational concept, if not the whole plan, but at least the concept of Hamas's operation on October 7th a year in advance. So the Israelis knew that the purpose was to bring Israelis back to Gaza to utilize in prisoner talks, prisoner exchanges, as well as to have, use them for political capital, right? Political currency in negotiations and all the other things. So the Israelis knew full well what they were doing when they said no vehicle gets back to Gaza, knowing that the purpose of this mission by Hamas was to take prisoners. Those vehicles be loaded with Israelis. We have other documentation, other reporting, clear evidence of instances, most prominently an Israeli tank that fired on a home that killed 13 Israeli civilians, where the commander said he knew full well what would happen, that we were going to kill the Israeli civilians in order to kill the Hamas prisoner taking and Hamas commandos, militants, again, whatever you want to call them. So this type of use of the Hannibal Directive on such a large scale, and also against Israeli civilians, I think that is something, how quickly it happened. I think one of my hesitations, let's say back in October when we were first discussing this, whether or not the Hannibal Directive was initiated, was the fact that could the Israeli military actually initiate the Hannibal Directive that quick? Like, wouldn't that have to go up to the chief of staff? Like, wouldn't that have to go to the prime minister's office? And obviously not, because this reporting seems to indicate that within an hour or so, the Hannibal Directive was put into place. And they have it. One of the things really impressive about, I'm sorry, I'm confusing another set of reporting this time that I'm thinking I've got in my head as well to what Plus 972, another Israeli media outlet, had put out concurrently as well, that Israel essentially has a free fire zone in Gaza, that their policy for their infantry and for their armor units is kill anything that moves. So when you couple that with the Hannibal Directive, you see the Israelis' clear disdain for life. You understand that their operation into Gaza was never anything military. It was never anything security based. It was always political. It was always been an attempt at ethnic cleansing. And if ethnic cleansing couldn't be achieved, it's a punishment. It's collective punishment against the Palestinians. That this has got, again, nothing to do with security and safety. It's got everything to do about conquest, about revenge, and about hate. And when you take the Hannibal Directive, you take this, what Plus 972 showed about how there are no rules of engagement for the Israeli military. Again, it is a kill anything that moves approach. You understand, coupled with all the things we've seen the last 9 months now, the bombardment, the sheer destruction, the sheer amount of bombs that have been dropped on Gaza, plus the starvation policy, the destruction of all the homes, the infrastructure, the deliberate targeting and destruction of not just the hospitals, but healthcare workers, on and on and on. We understand how that calculates into a genocide. But now we can clearly see as well, because what also came out this weekend in reporting was the Lancet, one of the world's premier medical journals. They've looked at this and they said, hey, based upon what we know from all other previous wars, we're looking conservatively at 186,000 Palestinians killed since October 7th, whether through direct combat or through indirect causes. So, I mean, you can certainly understand how that number is entirely possible when you're not just looking at the destruction taking place in front of us, right? All the video, all the commentary, all the witnessing that we have coming out of Gaza, but as well the overall theory, the culture, the philosophy, the metaphysical nature of the Israeli military, the government, the state, the Zionist cause. You see how, yes, absolutely, how very possible we are looking at least 8% of the Palestinian population in Gaza dead because of Israel's actions.
How would this article in the Lancet affect the public opinion in the world? I'm not talking just about the Middle East. How do you see the effects of these type of articles that are showing what's going on really on the battleground? Do you see any sort of understanding on the part of the governments and the public opinion that is forcing the governments? It's amazing to see that we are seeing right now what's going on in Gaza is the public opinion is way ahead of the governments when it comes to Gaza. It doesn't seem that the government is keeping the way that the public opinion is going and asking for more measures when it comes to the conflict in Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, well, in the United States, I don't know what impact it will have, if any. If you go on to your Google News aggregator or your Apple News aggregator, or you just, a search through the various major American media websites, the corporate media websites, you'll see no reference to the three things that were massive news stories this weekend. You'll see no reference to the Hannibal Directive. You'll see no reference to the Israeli policy of kill anything that moves. I mean, both of those things clearly documented, as well as, too, again, the Lancet, not something that you can discredit, but the Lancet saying that this is what we believe, again, and based upon this is how it works in other wars. I mean, they're not saying anything different or anything new, and they're leading with this is the most conservative. You won't see that anywhere in American media. And so I don't think the impact on Americans will be that great, particularly but it will have an effect in a different manner in the United States. What we saw happen last month in the U.S. Congress, maybe it was early this month, the House of Representatives passed a bill that would outlaw the U.S. State Department, in effect, the U.S. government, from citing Gaza Ministry of Health, Palestinian Ministry of Health figures on the dead, the wounded, the missing, right? So you had basically an outlawing of the truth, an outlawing of speaking facts, and that, of course, extends indirectly to any other sources. So you have an American government, American Congress, that is doing everything it can to protect its vassal state, its client state, again, whatever you want to call it. I mean, all this is so fungible in terms of our terminology, because it all takes place in different manners and with different narratives, depending upon what your perspective is. So I think you'll see that continuation in the U.S. of the system, the establishment, the elites, the government, the empire, whatever, again, working harder to protect itself meaning that it becomes more censorious, it becomes more tyrannical, it becomes more aggressive in suppressing any dissent, in suppressing any form of truth, in suppressing any form of reporting, and essentially, of course, any narrative that goes against the empire's narrative. So you have, I mean, that's what I think you're looking at in the U.S. is this continuing fight, this continuing chipping away at the empire. And the fact that we now have evidence in hand. Ralph Nader said this a few months ago, several months ago, that he believed more than 200,000 Palestinians were dead. And at the time, that's great to say, Ralph, but we don't have anything to point to really demonstrate that. Yeah, we see what our eyes and ears say. And if you're smart enough, you could think back and, okay, this is how it works in other wars. So you can do the calculations, which is what the folks at the Lancet did. And I assume we will see these type of figures coming out of the UN, from other NGOs like Physicians for Social Responsibility, other groups like that will confirm and affirm what the Lancet is saying. But now we have it. And so I think what we all knew in the back of our heads to be true, that this genocide is certainly not limited to the numbers that are coming out of the Gaza Ministry of Health, particularly when you start calculating all the indirect causes. I mean, how could it not be? We see all those collapsed buildings. And how could there only be 10,000 people missing? We have heard for 9 months now about the deprivation, the deliberate deprivation of Gaza by the Israelis across all types of lines and modes and manners. And how could there only be this many dead? They've dropped 75,000 tons of bombs on an area of 25 square miles. 75 tons of bombs. I mean, that's what, 4.5 Hiroshima bombs? I mean, like, so, maybe five, I guess 5 Hiroshima bombs, if I do the math right. I mean, so like that type of thing, it just affirms what we know. It supports us, and we go forward with it, and we can continue to chip away at empire. And I think overseas, outside the U.S., hopefully it galvanizes more action. Hopefully, Spain joined South Africa's ICJ, International Court of Justice, genocide case against Israel. Hopefully, this pushes others, and hopefully, we'll see, say, Ireland join as well. But then outside of Europe, throughout the global South, I think just already confirms what they knew as well, and hopefully, it just provides more space for their political leaders to act. And some of that will be, again, this chipping away at empire. This is one more reason to move away from the psychopathic United States. This is one more reason to get away from this monster. And, as well as to then turn and go into organizations that are alternative to the American empire, to the America's hegemony, so chiefly through BRICS, and chiefly through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which just had a big meeting in the past week. So we'll continue to see that. And this knowledge, this understanding, this is documented. This is what's occurring there. This is what Israel's doing. The United States isn't just standing by Israel. It's making this all possible. Israel couldn't do this without the United States. Well, that hopefully is providing that political capital, that currency for political leaders around the world to act, and also providing more grist for their people to galvanize and put pressure on them. I mean, something like this, it's being reported all through the Middle East. How this doesn't shake the palaces, in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, in Turkey, in Egypt, right? So that push. And then, of course, what you see with this continuing, as we open with talking about Lebanon, this threats of Israel to reinvade Lebanon, to, hey, third tries a charm, I guess. You're right. But this, that type of, okay, what is the Arab world? What is the Muslim world? What is the global South? What is the, non-NATO world going to do about this? Because now we know the extent of what's occurring there. And 186,000 dead, we need to emphasize, because the Lancet emphasized this, that is the best case. That is as if today we waved a magic wand and it all stopped. And 186,000 dead. If the shooting, the killing, the destruction, the genocide stopped today, you're still looking at that many dead in Gaza at a minimum. And so how can the rest of the world not act on that knowledge itself? I don't know. And I think what it really pretends, though, is in the future, as we look at the trends of this, that the next circumstance like this, the next type of Syria, the next type of Gaza, the next Ukraine, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, there may be the ability of the world to act with real consequences against the American empire. And so, as an American sitting here, of course, my own preservation, my own prosperity, I don't want to see that happen. So it's twofold, right? Then, of course, the world outside the American empire, those opposed to it, acting to build mechanisms to harm, to cause consequences to the empire, and those of us within the empire trying to dismantle it, or at least get it to a point where it's not causing as much harm in order to avoid those consequences.
Matt, whenever we talk about Israel, if you remember that talk of Joe Biden when he was so young, he said that if there was no Israel in that region, we had to create Israel in order to help the United States in that region. But how this behavior, how this type of attitude on the part of Israeli government would benefit the United States?
Oh, it doesn't. It doesn't. But that's not the concerns of the elites within the American empire. And go back almost 100 years now, or 100 years now. You understand the British purposes in Palestine, the British purposes in creating Israel, and the Governor General of Jerusalem, his name's escaping me right now, but, he said back in the 30s, said, our purpose here is to create a loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabs. And then when the American empire takes over from the British Empire and inherits from it, this is what we have. I mean, you see where the United States is, how isolated it has become over this, how the rest of its empire, its allies are being dragged along with it, and it's just embarrassing and hurtful and painful. But within the empire, there are the elites, who are benefiting from the status quo, and they want to maintain the status quo, even if the status quo is eroding everything underneath them. So, I mean, they are trying to get all the benefits they can. They're trying to get the gold as they can, before it evaporates, and ignoring all the destruction, the erosion, the disruption that's occurring around them, because they're so concerned about the present moment, about the short term. And that's the essence of the United States, whether it's our politics, whether it's our economy, what's best for us in our own selfish short-term interests. And so for, say, American politicians and the policymakers that serve them, their best interests have been to continue to support Israel, because that is a way to ensure that the pro-Israel lobby gives me and my campaign money and not a competitor money, because they know that's exactly what's going to happen. We just saw that here in the U.S., where Jamal Bowman was defeated in New York, and the Israel lobby put almost $15 million into a U.S. House of Representative race. I mean, it's just massive. I mean, should be a massive, massive constitutional crisis here in the United States. That type of foreign influence in an election, of course, there's no response, because, again, the status quo is preferable. It's the same reason why is Joe Biden still running? Why is he the candidate? Because for the Democratic Party elites, Joe Biden as the candidate was the best thing for the status quo. And what was best for the status quo was best for these elites, and so on. So keeping Israel as a core proponent, as one of the top 2 or 3 points of American foreign policy, that's best for the status quo. And what's best for the status quo is best for me and my interests, my personal interests, my institutional interests, my bank account, what have you, as well as, too, we can't also disregard that American foreign policy is owned by an ideology, a neoconservative, liberal interventionist ideology that is all based upon the religion of American exceptionalism, that is a real belief. There are real adherents to that throughout the United States, and Washington, D.C. is completely consumed by that. People like you or I, or the folks who are listening and watching, we're complete outliers. We are apostates. What we're saying is heretical. So we have to understand that just as much as there's a transactional nature of the Israel-U.S. relationship and why that keeps this whole thing going, there's also too again the metaphysical, the philosophical, the ideological belief system that is what, because you look at those who are empowering DC, yeah, they're certainly making good money. But there's a lot of people in DC who never leave DC and cash out. They never go to Raytheon. They never go to Booz Allen Hamilton. They never go to ExxonMobil. They always stay in DC because what concerns them, what motivates them is the argument of it all, the romance of it all, the quest to be right, as well as the imperial prestige. This idea, this would motivate so many American military officers, this idea of being the legion of the American empire, right? And that ties into, and for the American military officers, they can get both. They can have the romance of the ideology, the romance of the American exceptionalist religion, and they can also eventually cash out because they have a direct line to go into the military industrial complex, to the Boeings, the Raytheons, the Lockheeds, et cetera.
When it comes to Israel and the public opinion in Israel, when this reality would hit Netanyahu and his administration in Israel?
I don't know if it ever will. I don't know if it ever will. It certainly hasn't hit the United States. I mean, we knew about, the more and more information that's coming out about 9/11, to go back to that. As we finally are having some trials regarding 9/11 in the United States, again, almost 23 years after the fact, and things are coming out of discovery, things are being disclosed. We're seeing the real involvement of Saudi personnel with the hijackers, direct, not indirect, but direct involvement, picking them up at the airport when they arrive in the United States. So that type of, but a lot of this information's been there. We've had this knowledge for a long time about the possibility of the Saudis. We've had people like Senator Bob Graham from Florida, who was part of the 9/11 Commission, who spoke to Paul Jay and was very, very clear that the Saudis were involved. As a member of the 9/11 Commission, he said, I saw things that tell me that the Saudis were involved. You've had FBI whistleblowers, you've had leaks, you've had just the evidence of it all sitting in front of us, and it hasn't hit us. The American people have not revolted against the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia. The American people would love to see us. I shouldn't say that. It's so blatantly in one big statement like that. But there are many Americans who would be okay with the United States dropping atom bombs all throughout Iran because we're still so upset about the 1979 hostages, but with the Saudi Arabia, because of the way that for the last 23 years, information about 9/11 has been manufactured and massaged and distributed to the American people to make it seem that if you have questions about 9/11, then that you're just some crazy truther who's trying to convince everybody that Dick Cheney planted bombs in the bottom of the World Trade Center. Right. So I think what you understand from, even though we're seeing some really great reporting coming out of Israel, a lot of what we know about it, the things that are confirming what Paul Craig Roberts said, are coming from Israeli media. So it's like, as this weekend we were talking about Haaretz or plus 972, Ynet's another one. There's all kinds of really great Israeli media out there. How much of that is Israeli public seeing? Haaretz is a big newspaper internationally, but it has a very relatively small distribution within Israel. These other media outlets, not even certain how much they're actually read by the Israelis. And if you listen to what people who are really smart, really know on Israel, like Israelis like Gideon Levy, they'll say that the Israeli public doesn't see any of this. If you turn on the Israeli television, there is just not a whisper of what is happening in Gaza, what's really happening there. Just as for so long in the U.S., we had that experience with Iraq and Afghanistan. Like when I remember, bring up Julian Assange, since he's still sitting over my shoulder, and thank God he is free. We talked about that a couple weeks ago, I guess. But when I first spoke publicly about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, it was in 2010 for the collateral murder videos, which were the videos of the Apache gunship killing innocent people, including Reuters camera crew, wounding children on a street in Baghdad in broad daylight, completely unarmed, no cause to do so whatsoever, and then laughing about it, mocking them, particularly when the kids were hurt. And being asked on MSNBC about that at the time, my response to it all was, what did we here in the United States, what did you all here in the United States think was happening in Iraq for the last 6.5 years? Because we were shielded from the reality of the war here. Now, what we're seeing with Gaza, such a triumph for independent journalism. This is another way we chip at the empire and bring it down, is through the work of people like you, Nima, as well as through all the reporting that's coming through, people's cell phones. And of course, the brave journalists, many of them martyred in Gaza, more than 130 at least, and that's been deliberate, right? You've seen the way that, whether it's the Israelis targeting Palestinian journalists, whether it's because they banned Al Jazeera from their country. How many Israelis do you think were actually watching Al Jazeera? Hardly any. But they're so threatened by the presence of that truth telling. And then, of course, here in the United States, the U.S. Congress bans any U.S. government or U.S. State Department officials from stating how many Gazans, how many Palestinians have been killed. The U.S. Congress is going to ban TikTok, right? So you have all those need to censor, that need to suppress, because it is such a threat. And that, should inspire us. That should, and we have to find ways then to communicate with those in Israel, to communicate with those in Russia, to communicate with those in Australia, wherever it may be, who are like-minded as we are, and realize the consequences of what the world order as it presently is what those consequences are, and what those consequences may be, and how we have to work together to change it.
Yeah. Just shifting the gear to the conflict in Ukraine. How did you find the Orban's visit to Kiev, to Russia, China? He's trying to do his best in order to bring some sort of sanity to the conflict in Ukraine. And it's so amazing that when we talk about left wing, right wing, it doesn't make sense anymore. And when we see Orban is doing everything to help Europeans, to help Ukrainians, Russians, I think to help everybody.
Two things: the goal of him to actually act like a head of state, right, and to do this, to go to Ukraine, talk to Zelensky, and then get on a plane, go right to Russia and talk to Putin. The goal of him to act like as a head of state. Just the rejection of that by the political leaders in the West, their anger at him for doing what is not just the right thing to do, but the obligated thing to do. That tells you everything to know about what the West is doing, about what the West's actions are, how they, in their anger at Orban's actions, they're exposing their shame at their inaction. I also think too that Orban is not just doing this because he's principled and he believes this is the right thing for me to do as a head of state. This is what I should be doing, but also as well, he is someone who's right there. And if someone doesn't do something, we're all going to pay, kind of thing. He realizes that what is coming towards him. He knows that the French, the Brits, and most especially the Americans view Eastern Europe, the Baltics, the Scandinavians, Central Europe, the Balkans, moving into maybe parts of Western Europe as expendable, that these are the real tripwires, and that if the war escalates and NATO goes to war in Ukraine, that the Russian strikes will not be on France, they will not be on Britain, they will not be on the US, it will not be on the nuclear powers. It'll be on Finland, it'll be on Romania, it'll be on Hungary. and that this is the way the calculations are made, especially in Washington, D.C. This is the American way of war. So particularly, it's been forgotten over and over again in the modern era. But this is the way to appropriately do imperial warfare, is to conduct warfare without any cost. So fund the war completely on credit, fund it completely on debt, right? Do one of the best things you possible to drive yourself up to $34 trillion on debt, have these endless wars, spend $1 trillion a year on your military, even more, about $1.3 trillion or $1.4 trillion is really what it comes out to. And then, of course, have your population face no consequences. So in the American way, you use contractors, you use covert or clandestine forces, you use things like drones, and then, of course, you use proxy forces, because it's much better for other people's kids to die than for our kids. We'll never hear about it. We don't care about it, so forth. The Americans certainly view that this war with Russia, we can escalate it up to the point that Helsinki is hit by a nuclear missile, right? We can escalate it up to the point that Romania has emptied itself of people because of, on and on and on. Like, I mean, though they will pay the consequences. And when we get to that point, that's where we really have to consider whether or not we need to de-escalate. But all this is expendable. They view it all as a buffer zone. So Orban, I think, realizes that, he knows that, and he sees the war happening right there, and what can I do to end this? He sees the duplicity of his fellow NATO states. He also knew the warmongering, fear-mongering. But what can I say? What can I do to at least have us have some serious conversations, at least show them up, at least highlight the fact that diplomacy is not occurring, in an attempt to do something to contrast with all the, to be polite, malarkey. And we've all, of course, seen what that looks like already, the commentary coming out of the Ukrainians, the commentary coming out of Brussels. I haven't seen really yet what the Americans have said today. I don't want to see it. It's not good for my mental health, like everyone else, right? But I mean, certainly we've seen it already. I mean, Jens Stoltenberg saying that, yesterday or the day before, saying that NATO needs to expand by 35 to 70 brigades. You're talking about, at a minimum, then you're talking about 8 to 10 divisions, essentially. I mean, that's that's what, 3 or 4 corps. You're talking about 2 armies, 2 real armies in the middle to, I mean, this is massive how big this is, type of thing. That's what they this is the stuff that Orban maybe was trying to preclude, to head off, as well as doing what he believes is necessary to try and bring this war to an end. There's a panic going around. Certainly, if people saw that video, or the video I'm thinking of Volodymyr Zelensky speaking in a day or so after the Biden-Trump debate, the man looked like he had seen a ghost. He was reminiscent of the way he looked in a meeting with Tony Blinken in the days following Russia's push into Kharkiv back in April, where they essentially just walked in, right? Where were all the fortifications? Where were all the defensive lines? What happened to the hundreds of millions of dollars that were supposed to be spent to build these things? The same look Zelensky had on his face when he realized it's all crock, it's all a farce, it's all a racket, was the same look he had following the Biden-Trump debate. You're seeing NATO continuing to try and Trump-proof NATO. And of course, Zelensky, most importantly, this week is reported in a couple places, certainly not widespread in the U.S., but this idea that if there's a follow-on peace summit, a second peace summit, following the one they just had in Switzerland, put peace summit in quotes because, of course, the Russians weren't invited, but that the Russians might be invited this time. And I think the calculations for the Ukrainians have to be right now, with the reality that you may have a Donald Trump presidency in January, being really good betting odds, that it's better to try and get a deal now, one that we can negotiate, than one that we're going to be handed as an ultimatum in January. So we'll see what comes of this, whether or not the Biden administration will go along with it, because the Biden administration is so committed. Their campaign, the Democratic Party, is so committed to their Russia-phobic narrative, the Russiagate hysteria of the last 10 years, this continuation of a 100-year-long Red Scare in the United States, that to give up that narrative for Biden to make peace with Vladimir Putin, the evil dictator tyrant of Russia, well, that upends the last narrative of the last 10 years. That upends the whole Putin-Trump nexus, right? That dismantles what the Democrats believe to be a winning narrative for them. So Zelensky may run into the hard realities of American politics. And maybe at night he's laying there realizing that he has become this decade's Afghan. All right. He has become this decade's Ashraf Ghani, which is always was going to be inevitable.
It seems to me like Zelensky is a little problem that you may have with your wife, that it goes just talking about a little thing that is happening at your home and just is growing and growing. Zelensky is like that little thing that is growing, just making Russia and China and right now NATO, they're confronting each other. Unbelievable what's going on right now. And how
Right. I mean, I saw
childish is
some.
this?
Yeah, I saw someone on Twitter X. I can't remember who it was now. Who was making this point about how the one of the newer talking points coming out of the U.S. and NATO and Ukraine has been that China is instigating. They've instigated the war in Ukraine, that they are the reason why Russia is still in this war. I mean, all this demonizing of China that, essentially you get to the point where they're saying it's not Russia's war, it's China's war in Ukraine. It's complete madness. And I guess it was always to be expected. China has been for so many American with their sycophantic vassals, and you got to understand why that is, because within their own little military industrial complexes in France and in Britain, if you have China as an enemy, well, that allows you to buy more ships. That allows you to buy more submarines. That allows you to buy more long-range fighter aircraft and strike aircraft. And then, of course, where are you going to base those aircraft? So that means we have to open up a French air base in wherever, Thailand or something. I don't know. But I mean, like that type of, wow, we can really get something out of this racket here. This is good stuff for us. And so that propels these European nations, just as the same way that Japan and South Korea and Australia show up to the NATO conferences, because they see that as a great way to open the door for more weapons, for more money, for larger militaries, for more support. They're also part of the club. Many of the idea of militarism isn't just anything that sticks with the Americans and with NATO. Militarism is something that is part of human nature. I mean, certainly the Japanese, you don't have to go too far back to see how fondly the Japanese embraced militarism to their own downfall. So, all these things, I guess, shouldn't be surprising. The lengths that they'll go to, the ridiculousness of it. But the only thing that's greater than that, the only thing that surpasses that, of course, is the danger of it. And this continual push for a war that we in the West can't win. I mean, if we get to the point in the West where our conventional weapons do work as we are assured they will, because we're not giving our best stuff to Ukraine, we still have a lot of things we could use against the Russians. And Russia certainly has its vulnerabilities, which we could get into. But the idea, best case then, if these weapons work, if these conventional weapons work, and our battle plans work in the manner that they assure us they will, that within 2 or 3 weeks, we will have decapitated Russian command and control. We have isolated their leadership from their forces. Their forces will essentially be useless because they won't know, they can't see, they can't communicate, on, and the whole thing will just fall apart then because you've ripped the skeleton out of it and the body will just fall to the ground, that type of thing. Okay, say that's best case, say it does actually work, which I don't think a lot of people are going to, again, that's not good betting odds, well, then okay, how do the Russians respond? And, doctrinally, there's an argument made, and the Russians have said this. Vladimir Putin himself just said it again last week, that we are looking at changing our nuclear policies, our nuclear doctrine. But we also have a feeling that, well, one, we shouldn't doubt what they're saying. We shouldn't doubt their drills, the Russians' drills. We shouldn't doubt their statements. And we should also understand that their doctrine is such that if they lose control of their command and control facilities, that is, in some people's views, and I agree with this, reason why the Russians would utilize nuclear strikes. And that's how you can get into a nuclear war. And that is best case. Okay, and I'm not saying that the Americans wouldn't initiate nuclear weapons, because that could be flipped on its head as well. Say in a conventional war with Russia, our weapons don't work. It's now gone 3 weeks and the Russians are still standing. And guess what? We're out of Schlitz. Our inventories are exhausted and we can't build anything, as we've seen the last couple of years, in any timely manner that's going to matter. And what are we going to do? We're going to load up the first infantry division on a ship and over the course of 2 weeks and sail them to Europe. If they get there, if they're not sunk by Russian hypersonic missiles and Russian submarines, so then what do you do? Right? We're losing this. What does the American president do? And the American president then very well might calculate that, you know what? If I launch a nuclear strike from a non-US site, so if I have a nuclear strike from Germany or from wherever, it's very likely the Russians will understand my calculation here, and they will respond back not directly against the US, but against where that strike came from. And then at that point, our escalation will stop. That's completely foolish. It's completely irrational. It's terrifying, but that's very well what might likely happen. All right. So there's arguments that can be made, very easily put forward scenarios where a conflict between the US and Russia goes nuclear very quick, whether it's a best case situations for the US or a worst case or most likely, the arguments are all there. And this is the type of danger that even if it is a 1% chance, you have to treat it as if it's almost a certainty. You have to. Everything we know about not just human nature and warfare tells us that, but also to what we specifically know about escalation theory. What war games after war games have shown, what leaders have said. When they talk to former Soviet and American officials after the Cold War, the documentation's there. Like, these guys would have used nuclear weapons. It was in the plans, but also too, when they were asked how it would have happened if X happened and then Y happened, both the Soviets and the American, in these kind of in the years after the Cold War, it would say, yeah, we would have gone nuclear. So it's there. So the idea that this is idle or it's okay, it's not a real certainty, maybe something else would happen, it doesn't matter because the risk is so great. And our foolish, inept leadership in the US is the prime concern I have about why we would get into a position, regardless of who would actually launch a first strike.